Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into a book you all suggested, Disconnected: How to Reconnect Our Digitally Distracted Kids by Mr. Thomas J. Kersting.
That's pretty relevant.
Oh,
Great.
absolutely, especially these days. I mean, every parent, teacher, really anyone who works with kids is seeing this firsthand, this whole digital world. It's changing what it means to be a kid.
It really is. And Kersting's perspective is particularly interesting here. He's a therapist, and a school counselor, so he's right there on the front lines. He's not just talking theory, he's seeing how this stuff plays out in real life.
Exactly. And the book, it's packed with real stories, research, and even some science to back it all up. But what really struck me was that opening chapter. I mean, he starts by talking about his own childhood in the 80s.
The good old days, right?
Right. Totally different world. He's talking about, riding bikes till dark, no cell phones, just free range kids. And then he contrasts that with kids today. So much of their life is through a screen. And it's not just about screen time, it's how it's changing them. Mentally, emotionally, even physically. He calls it a digital disconnect. And that really hit home for me.
Yeah, I can see why. That comparison, 80s versus now, it really highlights how much things have shifted. And the whole point of the book, as I see it, is to really dig into how this digital world is impacting kids in ways we're only beginning to understand.
Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first things that really caught my attention was this idea of acquired attention deficit disorder.
Oh, that's a powerful one.
Right. So he was part of this committee at a high school, the Intervention and Referral Services Committee. And he noticed around 2009, there was this sudden increase in teenagers being diagnosed with ADHD. And the thing is, ADHD is usually, diagnosed way earlier in childhood.
Yeah, that's unusual. So what was going on there?
Well, that's what he's trying to figure out. He starts talking about this concept of neuroplasticity. It's how the brain can actually change and rewire itself based on our experiences.
Right. Our brains are constantly adapting. So is he suggesting that all this screen time could be changing kids' brains in a way that looks like ADHD?
That's exactly what he's saying. Maybe all this digital stimulation is making it harder for them to focus, to pay attention in class, to organize themselves, things that, are classic ADHD symptoms.
It's an interesting idea. And he goes on to talk about neural pathways, right? Those connections in the brain.
Yes. He describes them like paths in a forest. The more you walk a certain path, the clearer and more defined it gets. So in the brain, the more we use certain pathways, the stronger those connections become.
And he says that to really rewire the brain, create a strong new pathway, it takes consistent stimulation, at least 3 hours a day of something.
3 hours. Now think about this, because he then drops the stat. A CNN survey found that the average 13-year-old is spending not 3, but 8 or more hours a day on screens. 7 days a week.
Wow. That's more than a full-time job.
Right. So it's they're living in this digital world almost constantly, and their brains, they're adapting to that. So they become great at processing all that digital information, but then they struggle with the slower pace of real-life conversations or school lectures.
It's their brains are wired for the digital world, but then they're kind of out of sync with the real world.
Yeah.
And it's not just attention and focus, right?
Mm-hmm.
He also talks about how this affects their emotional development, their ability to connect with others.
Exactly. He talks about this rise in what he calls emotional fragility. Kids are having a harder time coping with, just normal everyday stresses and challenges. And he thinks part of it is because they're not getting enough practice with those social skills, with real world interaction.
Because they're always on their screens, right?
Yeah. And he makes this observation, which I think a lot of us can relate to. You go out to a restaurant or you're in a public place, and everyone's just on their phones, even when they're with other people.
Right. More connected to their devices than to each other.
Exactly. And that's what kids are seeing and learning. So they're missing out on all those subtle cues like facial expressions, tone of voice, all that stuff that helps us navigate social situations.
And those are skills you need, not just for making friends, but for handling conflict, working through disagreements. It's all part of being human.
And without that practice, he's seeing kids who are more anxious, more stressed, and have lower self-esteem. He even mentions this shift in the types of cases he's seeing in his practice. Less ADHD misdiagnosis and way more anxiety disorders, especially in middle schoolers.
So it's this constant digital connection is coming at a cost.
Mm.
And then he gives that example of Sarah, the teenager who's, always on her phone, even first thing in the morning. It's pretty typical, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's almost like a default setting for a lot of kids. And it makes you wonder, What happens when these kids grow up? How are they going to navigate things like, say, job interviews, where they have to make a good first impression, connect with someone face to face?
He brings up some interesting feedback he's gotten from, like, job recruiters. They're saying that recent grads are lacking some of those basic social skills. They're not making eye contact. They're not engaging in conversation naturally. It's almost like face-to-face interaction feels awkward to them.
It's like they're missing that spark, that charisma. And it's not just jobs, right? He's also seeing it in kids' personal lives. Kids who struggle to make friends, who get anxious in social situations.
And then there's this whole concept of neural pruning, which is kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
Basically, the brain, it gets rid of connections, pathways that aren't being used.
Yeah.
So if those pathways for social skills aren't getting activated because kids aren't interacting face to face, they can get pruned away.
Like use it or lose it. But on a brain level,
Exactly. It's like if you don't exercise those social muscles, they atrophy. And he has this really striking analogy. He compares it to like a seasoned alcoholic.
okay, how does that work?
Well, he says, think about someone who's been drinking heavily for a long time. Their brain has adapted to being in that state of intoxication. So when they try to get sober, it feels completely foreign, uncomfortable.
I see. So he's saying that for some kids, their brains are so used to the digital world that the real world feels like alien to them.
Right. He even uses this example of Jan, a young adult with really severe anxiety. And get this, her anxiety actually got worse when she tried to disconnect from her devices, when she tried meditation. It's like her comfort zone was the online world.
It's kind of sad when you think about it. He also tells this story about a sports team that had a no cell phone rule on an overnight trip. And one of the parents was really upset, like frantic, that their child wouldn't be in constant contact.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the kids, right? It's the parents, too.
Yeah.
This anxiety around being disconnected.
And then he tells this other story about an injured barn owl. They tried to release it back into the wild, but it couldn't survive because it had never learned how to hunt.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. But I see where he's going with this.
Right. Like if kids are constantly immersed in screens, they're not developing those essential life skills, those things they need to thrive in the real world. And then he brings in the hard numbers. This 2015 study by Common Sense Media found that teenagers are spending, on average, 9 hours a day on electronic media.
9 hours? That's crazy.
And that doesn't even include time spent on schoolwork. Heavy users, they're spending over 13 hours a day. So we're talking about a huge chunk of their waking hours.
No wonder we're seeing these like ripple effects across so many areas of their lives. And he doesn't just talk about the research. He actually describes what this looks like, in real life. Like you walk down a high school hallway and it's just rows of kids glued to their phones, completely oblivious to each other.
It's so true. And it's the same at home, right? Family sitting together, but everyone's on their own devices. And it's not just about disconnection. He talks about some of the actual physical dangers, like with those virtual reality games, people getting injured, even needing to be rescued because they're so absorbed in the game, they lose track of their surroundings.
It's like that line between virtual and reality. It's getting blurrier and blurrier.
Yeah.
And then there are those, more subtle things like phantom vibration syndrome.
Oh, yeah, where you think your phone is vibrating, but it's not.
Right. And apparently most college students experience this. It's like our brains are so wired to those devices that we're starting to hallucinate them, basically.
And then there's the actual physical problems. He talks about selfie stomach, which is like this repetitive strain injury from taking too many selfies.
Seriously.
Yeah. And then there's all the neck and back pain from hunching over phones and tablets. He mentions this study that found the pressure on your neck can increase to like 60 pounds when you're tilting your head down at a 60-degree angle. Right, and that kind of strain over time, it can cause serious damage, even lead to surgery. And then there's that story about the young man who was killed by a train while wearing headphones.
Oh, that's awful. But it makes you think, right? Like, how much are we tuning out the real world when we're plugged in?
And he even challenges this idea that listening to music helps you focus while you're doing homework.
Really? I always thought that helped.
I know, me too. But he's saying it actually divides your attention. He gives this example of trying to read while you're exercising and music is playing. It's harder to retain the information. And he makes this other point about headphones, like if we're constantly wearing them, we might actually start to feel uncomfortable when we're not.
Like we become dependent on that constant auditory input. Okay, so lots to think about there. And then he gets into social media, right? And how all that impacts kids' mental and emotional well-being.
Yeah, and this goes back to that idea of neuroplasticity, how the brain is constantly changing. He's saying that even stuff that seems harmless, like scrolling through social media, looking at selfies, it can actually have a big impact on kids' emotions.
It's like that constant comparison, right?
Yeah.
Seeing everyone else's supposedly perfect lives.
Exactly. He talks about the CNN documentary Being 13, where a lot of the kids admitted to using social media as a way to measure their social standing. It's almost like a popularity contest playing out online.
And for kids who are already, struggling with self-esteem, that can be really damaging.
Yeah.
He makes this really interesting point about how true self-worth, it has to come from within, not from external validation like likes or comments.
Right, like you're enough just as you are. And he gives this example about schools banning celebratory sweatshirts because they might hurt the feelings of kids who weren't invited.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And while I get the intention, he's saying that by protecting kids from all disappointment, we're actually preventing them from developing resilience.
That ability to bounce back from setbacks, right?
Right. Exactly. And he tells the story about coaching a kid named James, who was already obsessed with getting likes on social media. And it made him think about the difference between self-esteem and others' esteem.
So others' esteem is when you're basing your worth on what other people think, right?
Right. And he ties this back to a study in the Journal of Experiential Psychology, which found that kids who have a strong sense of purpose, like they know what they're passionate about, they're less affected by all that social media feedback. It's like having that inner compass helps them stay grounded.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got attention issues, emotional fragility, social skills deficits. What else?
Well, then he gets into sleep deprivation, which is huge. Kids are staying up late, chatting, scrolling, playing games, and it's affecting their grades, their mood, their anxiety levels.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it is. And he actually provides a whole list of warning signs that parents can look out for. Like if your kid is constantly losing track of time online, getting agitated when you interrupt their screen time, preferring to interact online rather than in person, always going over their time limits, forming most of their relationships online, losing interest in other activities.
Okay, that's a lot. Anything else?
Yeah, there's more. Feeling restless when they can't use their devices, neglecting homework or chores, sneaking around to use devices, lying about their usage. It's like a checklist for digital dependence.
Wow. So what's the solution?
Well, he talks about the importance of setting clear guidelines, like no devices in bedrooms, no phones at the dinner table, that kind of thing. And then, most importantly, enforcing those rules consistently.
Easier said than done sometimes, right?
Oh, for sure. But he stresses that it's crucial. And it's interesting, he also brings up potential gender differences in how social media affects kids. He cites some CDC data showing that suicide rates for girls have increased drastically, more so than for boys. And he suggests there might be a link to the pressures of social media.
It's like that whole comparison trap can be even more intense for girls, especially with all those image-focused platforms.
Right. And he quotes this author, Rachel Simmons, who wrote a book called Odd Girl Out. She says, "Social media is girl town." It really highlights how girls are often the dominant users on these platforms and the potential for that to be, really harmful.
It's definitely something to be mindful of.
Hmm.
Okay, so what about multitasking? It's like everyone expects kids to be able to juggle a million things at once these days.
And that's something he tackles head on. He actually starts by addressing this common question from parents, like, why is my kid taking so long to do their homework? And his answer is, often it's because they're trying to multitask. They're studying while texting, scrolling, the whole works.
Yeah. Right, because that's how they think they're supposed to work.
Exactly. But he uses this classic experiment, the basketball pass, counting one, to show how multitasking actually makes us less effective. You're so focused on counting the passes that you miss other obvious things happening in the video.
Right, you're not fully present in any one task.
And he brings up research on drivers showing that when they're listening to music, even just music, their brain attention to driving drops significantly.
So even something that seems simple, like listening to music, can be distracting.
Exactly. He tells the story about a mom who was worried because her daughter was taking forever to do simple homework assignments. And it turned out she was constantly switching between tasks, getting distracted, and it was just making everything take longer.
Makes sense. It's like that constant switching, and it disrupts your flow, your focus.
Right. And when it comes to writing, he's saying that multitasking can lead to work that's fragmented, disorganized, like you're missing those key elements of good writing.
So it's better to just focus on one thing at a time.
That's what he's arguing. And he even brings up this debate about laptop note-taking. There's this guy, Jeff Guo, who's really against it. And then there's that study from West Point that found that students who took notes on laptops actually did worse on conceptual questions than those who took handwritten notes.
Interesting. So even if you're not, actively browsing the internet,
Yeah.
just having that laptop there can be a distraction.
Right. And he mentions this white paper from Common Sense Media, which
Sure.
basically concludes that multitasking is bad for learning, for schoolwork, for memory. And it can even erode our empathy and make us less inclined to have face-to-face conversations.
So it's not just about efficiency, it's about how we connect with each other, how we develop as human beings.
Exactly. Okay, ready for another heavy topic?
Get me with it.
Video game addiction.
Well-
He starts with this story about Alex, this kid who was spending 12 hours a day gaming, and his dad had no idea. He just thought his son was bored.
Wow. So it can be hard to spot, especially for parents who might not be familiar with the science.
Right. And then he talks about some of the more extreme cases, like in Taiwan, they actually have laws holding parents accountable for their kids' excessive gaming. And in some Asian countries, they have these boot camp style rehab centers.
Seriously.
Yeah. And he shares some really disturbing examples, like teenagers who are so addicted, they're neglecting their hygiene, their health. He even mentions this horrific story about a kid who cut off his own hand to try to stop playing.
Oh my God, that's terrible. But it just shows how powerful this addiction can be.
It does. And he talks about how it can lead to social isolation, anxiety, like kids are spending all their time in the virtual world and they're not developing those real life connections.
And for parents, it's a tough situation,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't want to just take away the games if that's their child's only social outlet.
Right. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
He includes some quotes from teenagers who are struggling with this addiction, and it's heartbreaking. They know it's a problem, but they can't stop. They talk about neglecting their responsibilities, feeling controlled by the game, spending hours and hours playing.
It sounds like any other addiction.
It really does. And there are physical health consequences, too. He mentions a case of someone developing deep vein thrombosis from sitting for so long while gaming. And then there are the statistics. NPD Group found that hardcore gamers are averaging 22 hours of gaming per week.
22 hours. That's more than some part-time jobs.
Right. And the video game industry, it's only going to get bigger. He also mentions that internet gaming disorder is now listed in the DSM-5, which is the big manual for mental health professionals.
So it's being taken more seriously as a real condition.
Exactly. And it's not just the time commitment. He talks about how gaming can affect self-esteem, relationships, because in the game, you can be whoever you want, right? You can achieve things you might not be able to in real life. So for kids who are maybe socially awkward, it can be really appealing. But it can also create this disconnect between their online persona and who they are in real life.
It's like they're living a double life. And that can be really confusing, especially for kids who are still figuring out who they are.
Right. And then there's the research linking video game addiction to sleep problems, which, as we talked about earlier, can lead to a whole cascade of health issues. He talks about this study that linked it to high blood pressure, unhealthy cholesterol levels, all these things that can increase the risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity.
It's like this digital world. It's not just affecting our minds, it's affecting our bodies too.
And then he shifts gears a bit and talks about this broader erosion of face-to-face interaction that we're seeing everywhere.
Mhm.
He gives this example of being at a restaurant and everyone's on their phones, even couples who are out on a date.
I see that all the time. It's almost like we've forgotten how to just be present with each other.
And it's not just adults. He talks about how parents are using screens to pacify kids more and more, even for short car rides. It's like the default response has become, here, have a screen.
Right. Instead of engaging in conversation, looking out the window, just being bored for a few minutes.
Exactly. And it's a big contrast to what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. They say no screens for kids under 18 months and only an hour a day for kids 2 to 5.
And how many kids are actually following that? Probably not many.
Probably not. And he tells this really relatable story about coaching his son's baseball team. They used to have these great conversations at dinner, but then all the boys got smartphones, and it was like someone hit the mute button.
It's like those screens, they create this invisible barrier between people.
And he talks about how important face-to-face communication is for kids' development, for their social skills, their emotional intelligence. He's seeing more and more teenagers in his practice who are struggling with anxiety, depression, and he thinks it's often tied to this digital disconnect.
And it's not just kids, right? He talks about how family dynamics have changed, how even when everyone's home, they're not really connecting.
Right. It's like everyone's living in their own little digital bubble. And then there's all the conflict over screen time, the risky behavior, like parents using phones while driving.
It's like this technology, it's supposed to connect us, but in a lot of ways, it's doing the opposite.
He tells this really powerful story about a suicidal teenager whose family started having these mandatory talk times every day, and it made a huge difference. It's like they finally started communicating again.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. Just talking to each other.
He even provides some conversation starters in the book to help families get those discussions going. And he mentions this reality TV show where families were challenged to have dinner together for 30 days, no phones, no distractions, and it transformed their relationships.
So what's the takeaway here? Like, what can parents actually do?
Well, he talks about these things called game face. They're like pouches that lock up your phone so you can create phone-free zones.
Interesting idea. But it sounds kind of extreme.
It is. And he's not saying that's the solution for everyone. He's more about empowering kids to develop self-control, to learn how to manage. Parents modeling that behavior, being present with their kids, putting their own phones away.
Lead by example, right?
Exactly. Okay, ready for a deep dive into emotional intelligence.
Bring it on.
He calls it EQ. And it's basically our ability to understand and manage our own emotions and to recognize and influence the emotions of others.
So like being self-aware, being able to empathize with others, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And he says it's incredibly important, maybe even more so than IQ when it comes to things like communication, building relationships, and even leadership.
He then introduces this model of EQ developed by Daniel Goleman, which breaks it down into 5 key areas: self-awareness, self-management, motivation, empathy, and social skills.
Right, and he explains each one. Like self-awareness is about understanding your own emotions. Self-management is about being able to regulate those emotions, not letting them control you.
And motivation, he specifically talks about intrinsic motivation, right? Like being driven from within, not just by external rewards.
Exactly. And then there's empathy, which is all about understanding and sharing the feelings of others. And finally, social skills, which are those, essential abilities to build and maintain relationships.
So it's like a whole toolkit for navigating the social world.
It is. And he makes this important point about how kids need to experience failure to struggle in order to develop their EQ. He's noticed that a lot of kids today are really uncomfortable with being wrong.
Right, because everything online is about being perfect, presenting this idealized version of yourself.
And he connects this back to technology use. He mentions research by Clifford Nass that shows a link between multitasking and the part of the brain that manages emotions. Basically, the more we multitask, the weaker that connection becomes, and it can lead to problems with emotional regulation, anxiety, depression.
It's like all that digital stimulation is overloading our brains, making it harder to process and manage our emotions.
And the key takeaway here is that EQ is primarily learned through face-to-face interaction, not through screens. We need to see those facial expressions, hear those subtle tones of voice, to really understand what someone else is feeling.
So all that time spent online, it might actually be hindering kids' ability to develop their EQ.
That's his argument, and he brings up this study on girls, which found that those who used media while socializing had more negative social and emotional outcomes. They felt less normal, more peer pressure, less sleep, whereas those who focused on face-to-face interaction had more positive outcomes.
So it's not just about the quantity of time spent socializing, it's about the quality of those interactions.
Exactly, and all of this ties back to that earlier point about the decline in social skills. He tells the story about a medical school grad who bombed their interview because they lacked basic communication skills.
Wow, even with all that education.
Right, and he describes seeing these two 15-year-olds trying to have a conversation, and it was just awkward. They didn't know how to read each other's cues, how to keep the conversation flowing.
It's like they're speaking different languages, even though they're both, from the same generation.
And he worries that this generation is going to enter the workforce lacking those essential social skills that are needed to succeed, to build relationships, to lead.
So it's not just about getting good grades, it's about being a well-rounded human being.
Exactly. And that leads into his chapter on raising leaders instead of followers. He talks about how parents sometimes, in their desire for their kids to fit in, they kind of compromise their own values. Like maybe they let their kid play an M-rated game even though they don't really approve of it.
Right, because everyone else is doing it.
Exactly. But he's saying we need to raise kids who can think for themselves, who have strong convictions, who can resist negative peer pressure.
Kids who can be leaders, not just followers.
Right. And he quotes Mark Little, who says, "A leader is someone who sees more than others see, who sees farther than others see, and who sees before others see." And he stresses that it's the parents' job to cultivate those qualities in their kids.
To help them develop that vision, that strength of character.
Exactly. Okay, now we're getting into the really thought-provoking stuff. His chapter on fragile kids and media impact.
I'm intrigued. What's he talking about there?
He starts by laying out this hypothetical scenario. Like, imagine there's a rumor about a luring attempt near a school, and it spreads like wildfire on social media, even though it's not true. But it creates this huge panic, this fear, even though there's no real danger.
Oh, I can see how that would happen. Social media can blow things out of proportion so easily.
And he connects it to this real-world example. Remember Hurricane Sandy? There was this false alarm that went out saying the storm was going to be way worse than it actually was. But the alarm spread on social media, and it created this mass hysteria that actually overshadowed the real impact of the storm.
Wow, so it's like this digital world is making us more susceptible to fear, to anxiety.
And he talks about how before the internet, we were mostly exposed to news and information from our local area. But now, with social media, we're bombarded with stories from all over the world all the time. And that constant exposure to negativity, it can be really overwhelming, especially for kids.
It's like we're constantly on edge waiting for the next bad thing to happen.
And he shares his own personal decision. He didn't give his kids cell phones until they were older. He wanted to protect them from all that drama, all that negativity, and just let them have a normal childhood.
It's a bold move in this day and age.
It is. And he addresses this common concern like, what about emergencies? But he makes us think about how reliant we've become on constant communication. Like, do we really need to be able to reach our kids every second of the day?
It's a good question. And then he talks about schools trying to ban cell phones. Right?
Yeah, some parents are really pushing for that.
Yeah.
But he points out that it's really hard to do legally and practically because parents expect to be able to reach their kids at any time, even during school.
It's like we've become addicted to instant communication.
And then he brings up this concept from a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. The authors, Lukianoff and Haidt, they talk about this growing trend of fragility, especially on college campuses. Like, students are demanding protection from anything that might offend them.
Oh, I've heard about that. It's like this whole culture of safe spaces and trigger warnings.
Right. And he connects it back to overprotective parenting, to this idea that kids aren't getting enough experience with discomfort, with failure. And that can make them more sensitive, less resilient. And then, of course, you've got all the digital distraction on top of that, which just exacerbates the problem.
It's like this perfect storm for creating anxiety and fragility.
It is. And while he doesn't have a chapter specifically titled Parenting from a Distance, it's definitely a theme that runs throughout the book.
Right, like parents being physically present but emotionally checked out because they're on their own devices.
Exactly. And kids missing out on that direct parental guidance because everyone's distracted.
It's like a form of neglect, even if it's unintentional.
And then finally, he ends with this chapter on using mindfulness and meditation to reconnect. It's all about like taking control of our thoughts, being present in the moment.
So it's like an antidote to all this digital distraction.
Exactly. He starts with this idea of walking with a lighter step. It's a metaphor for how our thoughts can weigh us down and how mindfulness can help us lighten that load.
I like that imagery.
He has you do this exercise where you time how long it takes you to walk to your car, and it makes you realize how much of our daily life is just automatic, how we're not really paying attention.
It's like we're on autopilot most of the time.
And he says that when we're not paying attention, our minds tend to wander, and those thoughts can be filled with anxiety, insecurity, especially for kids.
So mindfulness is about bringing our attention back to the present moment.
Right, exactly. And he says that when we do that, when we focus on the present, we actually create more mental space. We're less caught up in those negative thought loops.
It's like we're giving our minds a break.
And he talks about how this practice can foster creativity, help us realize that our inner world is more important than all the external stuff, all the gadgets and distractions.
It's about shifting our focus from the outside to the inside.
And he stresses that learning to control our minds, to focus our attention, it's crucial for overcoming anxiety, for developing resilience.
It's like building mental strength.
Right. And he even gets into this kind of spiritual stuff. He talks about waking up the mind to the power within through mindfulness.
Okay, now we're getting deep.
He even uses this analogy of electricity. Like, we can't see electricity, but we know it's real, it has power. And he compares that to the power of our minds, our thoughts. He says that what we focus on, what we believe, it can actually shape our reality.
So it's like the power of positive thinking, but on the deeper level.
Right. And he talks about how through his work as a therapist, he's developed this kind of sixth sense for picking up on other people's emotions. And he encourages us to believe in those abilities, to trust our intuition.
So it's not just about logic and reason. It's about tapping into something deeper.
And he defines faith simply as trust. trust in ourselves, trust in something bigger than ourselves. And he ends with this really powerful quote from Andrew Carnegie. He says, "Believe that you will succeed, and you will." It's all about the power of belief to shape our lives, our children's lives.
It's a beautiful way to end the book with this message of hope and empowerment.
It really is. That's Disconnected, How to Reconnect Our Digitally Distracted Kids.
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me and helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.